And while we're talking about universities, our next speaker is from Cambridge University, and I'd like to welcome Lindsay Hooper to the stage. Welcome, Lindsay. Lindsay currently runs the Institute for Sustainability Leadership. Now, this is an institute within Cambridge University that brings together senior leaders from all over the world, from entrepreneurs to business leaders, governments, financial institutions, civil society representatives, and philanthropists. The aim is to help them lead economic change at scale, to address environmental challenges, and address market failures in this area. The Institute for Sustainability Leadership currently has a network of over 40,000 people worldwide. Lindsay, for many years, I think you've focused on working with listed institutions, listed entities, but I understand that you now have a growing focus on working with private finance and influential families. Why is this? Why this shift?
Absolutely. Real pleasure to be here. And I should say I walked over, so I feel very much at home, having walked through the rain. Yes, we're an unusual department within a university in that we don't work with undergraduate students. We work with senior leaders in support of economic change. And we've had a chastening introduction to the challenges we face and to the limited progress to date in addressing them. And much of our work is focused on addressing the challenges of climate change and environmental degradation, which we know, we can see, are growing and increasingly having significant costs and impacts for communities. Some of the families that we work with actually can no longer live in the regions that they call home because of climate impacts. And we know that there are vast resources, still not enough, but vast resources going to tackle these challenges. But much of that is focused, I suppose, on the downstream issues, on the symptoms and consequences, on supporting communities that are affected, on restoring land that's been degraded. But in our view, that will be futile until we start getting upstream and start to design out the root causes of these challenges. There won't be enough capital in the world to deal with the consequences while we still keep making the problem worse.
So we need to prevention rather than dealing with the symptoms.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, and in our view, the core challenge is our current model of economic growth. So growth is essential. Everything in nature grows. And economic growth over recent decades has been amazing. Billions of people's lifestyles have been improved. The challenge is our model of growth, our approach to growth, which is a drawdown on the Earth's resources, which are finite, and then the production of waste, pollution, greenhouse gases. And that's now at such a scale, given the scale of global growth, that actually the planet can't sustain it. So we're out of harmony with nature fundamentally. And my institute, founded by King Charles 30 years ago, was absolutely recognizing this challenge, and we were founded to work with businesses and financial institutions to support them to address this challenge, because most of their business models are fundamentally part of the problem. So that's why we were set up to educate, to support innovation. And I think most major businesses recognize the challenge. They know that their own, never mind themselves and their families, their commercial future is at risk if we don't address these challenges. And there are millions of people within businesses that care deeply. And it's not just young people, it used to be. Increasingly, we see people at very senior levels who say, I don't want to wait till I leave and then put something back. What can I do now? And I think some of the early progress we made on the SDGs, businesses were waking up to this and making commitments and trying to, I suppose, be better corporate citizens. But our conclusion is, after 30 years, they're hitting barriers. They're trying to do these things while the markets don't reward it. In fact, markets often punish them. It's quite hard for businesses to make long-term investments when actually markets reward them only for their short-term returns. So many leading businesses are actually failing to deliver on their commitments. They're stepping back. They're seeing backlash in the markets. And so we need to address that. And because of that, we also acknowledge the government challenges in a lot of, I suppose, more populist Western democracies. It's really hard for governments to tell the truth to citizens about the tough choices ahead. That's really challenging. But because of the urgency, we of course can't sit back and just wait for young people to somehow solve all of this. That would be deeply irresponsible. So we've concluded that we need to work with those with power, with wealth and influence now, and who've got more freedom to be able to take leadership and to open up the solution space. So we've proactively started working with private wealth and with philanthropy because, I mean, there are many strengths, but that long-term perspective, which is really important because these are long-term challenges, that relative freedom to be able to take risks, to be able to invest for the long term, often a greater sense of community and purpose to society, a real commitment and a sense of place. And I think that agility, we heard about the importance of being entrepreneurial and agile, so we really sense that. So actually some of the more interesting and exciting developments that we're seeing that are opening up credible pathways for impact are coming from the private sector.
That's really interesting. So you're actually saying that in fact, the sort of private capital, if you like venture capital, can take more risks and shift the dial in this area. I mean, can you give me an example, for instance, of that?
Sure. So maybe if we look at the whole spectrum of capital at the moment, we've still got trillions of dollars of core mainstream institutional capital invested in activity which is undermining the planet fundamentally. We have a lot of talk about, say, nature positive activity, but we don't do enough to stop the nature negative activity. And in spite of a lot of, I suppose, the economic analysis that we see, which is saying investing early is good, and in spite of the direct consequences to institutional finance, the insurance sector being hit, we still see most institutional capital focused in ways that are focused only on short-term returns, that don't price in the full social and environmental cost of activity, and it's not yet reaching where it's needed. So it's not reaching young entrepreneurs. It's not reaching some really exciting innovations on the ground, say in Africa, where sovereign risk ratings might be an issue or where it's too small scale to be attractive. So I think, though, if I to give you some practical examples of what we're seeing, there are some market-based approaches, so some moves within existing market structures, so some really big bets that will be so big they will disrupt markets. So things like Andrew Forrest's work in Australia, so buying into big bets on future energy can disrupt.
Sorry, just repeat that. The forest.
So Twiggy Forrest, Andrew Forrest in Australia is privately wealthy and backing some really big moves. So that can disrupt markets by being that big a move. There's also the role of private finance as catalytic capital, of course, taking that early risk, providing guarantees, enabling entrepreneurs to build a track record so they can attract funding. But I think there's some really interesting new spaces being opened up through philanthropy rather than venture funding, and that's to fundamentally change markets. So I think there's some interesting moves that are, it might seem quite dull and in the technical space, but to bring real rigor to carbon and nature markets so that institutional capital can flow, or to bring some standardization to sustainable financial transactions. But there's also really interesting work to build social, business, financial institution momentum and support for more ambitious government action to change the rules of the game, to make capital work for the long term, to price in the impacts. So we see a lot of interesting work there that's about building momentum so we get better regulation, so we can start to design out some of these challenges.
So you think that philanthropic capital can actually change markets?
It already is in some areas, in both of those ways, both within the markets and working to help to redesign the markets within which institutional capital is being deployed to provide those unlocks that will mean that we can move the trillions of institutional capital.
Now, given that we've just had COP29 in Baku, given the extreme weather events that we're seeing all over the world, are you finding that there's more interest now in climate and environment from family foundations and trusts?
Absolutely. We're definitely seeing a lot more interest. I was at, Baku's equivalent to COP in Dubai last year. Major philanthropy and private sector showed up last year very significantly, and there was a very large, well-attended forum there. So we're seeing, yes, much greater interest, but as in similar statistics we just heard to young people, is still relatively low. I think the World Economic Forum's figures say that perhaps only 6% of global philanthropy is being focused on climate and nature at the moment. So it's from a relatively low base at the moment. At the moment, a lot of that, I think, is from the US and so North America. There was a big announcement over the weekend from a group of Canadian families who are working together in support of Canadian decarbonisation and response to climate change. After that, Europe, but I know that it's really rising up the agenda in Asia too. But I think that as well as there being increased interest, there are some real challenges that we see that are really relevant to our ability to address these challenges. And we've already heard from some of them already, the fragmentation. In the same way as we look at listed businesses, the cumulative impact of individual business action won't get us to where we need to be, and the cumulative impact of individual foundations also won't get us to where we need to be. There's also, we see in the families that we work with, some resistance to engaging with systems change. It's like too abstract, too boil the ocean, not enough confidence that it will have impact. Much more desire to have more tangible, practical on the ground, but actually the unlocks are systemic. So there's an appetite there. We need governments, we need businesses to engage as well, and there can be some resistance. There can be, well, businesses should pay for it themselves, and do we trust governments? And they're bureaucratic and inefficient, and easy to waste money. And in some regions, there's corruption and lack of trust in governments and governance. But we have no option to have better engagement there. And as we heard, some of the processes can be just too bureaucratic and not agile enough in a changing context. So I think we're going to have to overcome some of those. But I think there are some really interesting new examples and new solution spaces. So Bloomberg Philanthropies, for instance, has a whole range of interesting examples. But in the US, for instance, they're doing work that convenes local communities, businesses, regulators, state by state, to secure buy-in to phase out coal-fire power plants. They are also doing work to build global capacity. So they've started a kind of a global capacity building coalition that enables South-South learning, that makes resources available, particularly for emerging economies who need to attract capital. We also see a lot of actually younger entrepreneurs, often people who've made their money through tech and are already having foundations to put things back, funding not just research in universities, but funding getting innovation into societies and economies. So, moonshot projects, how do we, rapidly decarbonize key sectors? So, Quadrature, Breakthrough, there's Bezos, maybe they're not so young, but there's quite a lot of capital focus there. And then there's some interesting pooling. There's the Canadian family as a co-impact, the West Gaia initiative, trying to bring together and pool funding to try to get some big systemic unlocks.
But still only 6%. I'm just going to come back because it's quite a shocking statistic that actually 6% of worldwide philanthropic investment, only 6% goes into environment.
So that's not my research. That's WEF research and figures from work they did.
The World Economic Forum.
Yeah. But
yes, and most of that's coming from North America.
At the moment, I think it's about 43%.
So that means here in Asia, there's relatively
lower. When I looked at the statistics from that, it was kind of 43%. I think North America. It might have been 27. Can't quite remember in Europe, and then it was broadly with the rest of the world, but Asia rising within that. But yeah.
Now let's talk about the work that your Institute of Sustainability Leadership does. I mean, can you give us some examples of how you work with leaders and particularly with influential families and philanthropy?
Sure. So one of the things you would expect us to do as a university is education. So that is absolutely one of the things we do. And in fact, last week we had held our program. So we run a program that's a multi-generational leadership program for families where we already talked about the importance of intergenerational learning. So we bring together people across generations, but we bring families together across geographies as well to not only learn from leading research and academics, learn from leading practice, from civil society, to be exposed to a whole range of perspectives, challenge, case studies, but really importantly to learn from each other. So education is one way. Convening is another. Universities are one place where you can really bring together people for candid, honest, difficult conversations, and that's something that we've increasingly been doing. So this year, broadly, people in my domain, our peers in the sustainability movement are recognizing that we're just not making progress and some of our ways of working are not effective enough, and recognizing that geopolitics, technology, we're starting to knock these global issues off leadership agendas. So we convened some of the leading foundations we work with alongside activists, leading businesses, media commentators, tech entrepreneurs together to say, let's be honest about what's not working. Let's step back and say, where are the most promising pathways? So that's another way. And of course, as a university, there's a huge amount of research that is underway, but actually, we do a lot of innovation. We have a lot of actually young entrepreneurs in our innovation ecosystem. In fact, my colleague Jays, who runs this, and we work with UNICEF as well. So we do a lot of work that is connecting capital to some of the most promising solutions. Of course, as a university, we also are very grateful recipients of funding, and some of that is being directed to strategic communications. So you're probably familiar with David Attenborough and some of his films, which have had a really major impact on raising public awareness of the challenges. So we've got funding to do that same kind of quality, that same kind of engaging communication to help raise public awareness and understanding to try and build momentum. So we engage there. Some convening around how do we get political ambition to act, funding there. But we also are very focused on how do we rapidly decarbonize critical sectors, so aviation, food, buildings. So funding there to say, how do we get rapid unlocks? And we've got some really exciting work in the aviation space that's saying we have to decarbonize it. And we have to do it in years, not decades. So research is helping to find what are the breakthrough, if we just did 5 things, what would those 5 things be through modeling? So those are some of the ways we work.
And is there a greater willingness, I suppose, amongst philanthropists and family foundations to invest in that kind of new technology to combat climate change than...
So I think, yes. And I think actually almost too much focus on the tech. So it's not that we still need more. We still have, I think the IEA says there's still, we have most of the technology we need, but there's the other gap of about 35%. So we absolutely need new technology. And there's a whole range of not fully tested, but potential technologies which are sitting in prototype stage. They're sitting and need to be scaled. There's a lot of appetite, and I think of the funding that's going into these issues is either going downstream to support communities affected or to restore nature, or into tech. And that's great, and we need that, but I think we also need more that's focused on the cultural barriers, the political barriers, the policy and regulatory barriers, and trying to get these market unlocks so we can get institutional capital, the trillions of capital to scale too. So I think there's not yet enough focus on those areas that are tackling the root causes.
Are you optimistic or confident that the next generation of philanthropists can or indeed will deliver solutions to some of these global challenges? Or help deliver?
Help deliver.
Help deliver.
I think we have no option. We've got a responsibility to believe it's possible, because what's the alternative? I think there's clearly evidence that younger people generally are more committed and more interested. Certainly and I think the World Economic Forum's analysis has said that they're twice as likely as their parents to focus their philanthropy on climate and nature challenges. Certainly the families that we work with.
Are you at the table often when those sort of generational, feisty generational discussions happen in families?
We have been, but I think they're perhaps more polite when we're in the room. We've heard anecdotally afterwards that there have been some even more challenging conversations when we're out of the room. But I think it's not just because they care more. I think these are the issues now. This is the context and the landscape that they're having to respond to. I also see a real commitment to educate themselves. We run a master's program on sustainability leadership, and over the recent years, we've really seen a significant increase in younger people who are about to inherit or stepping into family businesses, choosing to come on programs to really build that depth of knowledge and a network that is outside of I suppose, what they sometimes say is quite a closed bubble, and they don't know who to trust. So building that wider network. So we've
it's a bit like that point that Edwina was making earlier about not knowing where to turn.
Yes.
there are actually courses you can do now.
Yes. But I think that is that's a program that is lots of people from business, from civil society, but a place that really does build quite a very strong sense of a peer community, having been through that. I think there's also education and engagement needed by the whole ecosystem of financial managers, advisors that support families, and I think a lot more work is needed there too. But when you asked, the question was, am I optimistic that young people can do it? I think it's really important that we don't leave it only to young people. Some of the challenges, the biggest challenges are market challenges, they're regulatory challenges. We need those people who understand how the world works, how business works, how markets work, how politics work, to bring that insight to the table, to bring their networks, their influence to the table too. It needs all generations really to be leaning in and bring all of those strengths. And we see that in corporate boards as well. We used to get boards saying, they tell me I'm the problem, these young people, that I'm a dinosaur. And we're saying, don't see yourself as the enemy. You are part of the solution too. It's really important that we value the strengths and experience that older generations have. But having said that, I do see some of the most exciting developments coming from younger generations.
Now, do we have any questions from the audience? Yes, here, if we can get a microphone to you.
Thank you for your interesting presentation. Two things. You mentioned communication was very key, and you also mentioned that so even collectively, all the families wouldn't be enough. It's just a drop. And obviously, there has to be a coalition between the families and, for example, governments and business.
Yeah.
Communication is part of this, and I'm onto this because yesterday I saw a very interesting thing on the news. I'm clearly a dinosaur because I read newspapers and I look at news. But it was on, they were interviewed, there was a thing on CNN about young voters under 30 in the last American election. And the vast majority got their news through social media and talk shows. So my first question is, how active are you in that? Because in that election, 46% of the youngsters voted for a climate change denier.
Yeah.
And then the second part of the question is, populist governments, what happened in America, there's elections in Germany next year. There are other countries where changes are inevitable, and populism generally is not so pro-climate change. How do you put all of that together? It's a complicated question, but
just the biggest questions in the world. So, but yes, we have to go there. And institutionally, we've stepped back. We've been working for 30 years and realized it's not working because we're not speaking to the right people and we're not speaking in the right language. And we've had to, in some ways, publicly acknowledge that. I've published a piece in the FT which is saying it's not working. We admit we risk being part of the problem because we talk the wrong language and we maybe imply that it's all happening and it's all good, and it's not. When I say we, I'm talking very in a sweeping generalization about people in the sustainability space, which is not completely accurate. But I think there has not been enough relevance to citizens' real day-to-day concerns. It's been very high level, it's been quite elite, it's about global challenges, it's not been talking enough about the things that are relevant to real lives, which then can be fueled by, sometimes it is vested interest driving populism, and sometimes it's genuinely people have been left behind, and why should they trust institutions? Because they haven't delivered. So I think an honest acknowledgement and speaking to people in language that works about their real realities, rather than assuming that everyone will somehow do something for the global challenge. I think we need to have a greater transparency and governance around vested interests that are lobbying to defend the status quo. So I think there's a need there. But I think there's also a need to not be so polite and think that, we always will, be lovely, good citizens and we'll do the good thing and we won't lobby. I think it's deeply naive when we see some of the forces we're up against. And I think people that care need to really engage in different ways. And I think you're right, social media we have to engage with. I think one of the biggest challenges is also younger males who actually feel quite alienated. There's not a role for them. They're just told, you know, vote for something for the future that won't give you anything. And I think a lot of populist movements have given them a role, have said, we need you, you know, you're part of a movement. And there's not been enough focus on younger males in particular to engage them and make this relevant to them. Sorry, it doesn't quite answer your question.
But I, as a journalist, I was going to follow up on that, because there's an interesting point in that the traditional media models have collapsed over the last 30 years.
Yeah.
And so that most young people are now getting their news through Facebook, or it's unfiltered, it's unedited. You talked about the importance of somebody like David Attenborough, funded by BBC, Public Service Broadcasting. Are we seeing any philanthropic money going at, I mean, I know we're seeing a little bit, but is there any interest in investing actually in coming up with new forms of journalistic models, you know, where we can fund proper journalism, where we can reach young people through getting good content, journalistic content on social media platforms? Are you seeing much interest in that?
So I see not quite enough on that latter point. I see some that's about having greater transparency and accountability for the media and pointing out where media has been captured and having sources of evidence and truth there, and supporting the education of journalists. So I do see work there. But what and it probably exists, it's just not my area of expertise, but it's not hugely visible that there's a huge amount. There's certainly some, and there are a whole range of different approaches to different forms of communication that is more engaging. But I think still some of it comes from an assumption that, you know, young people just inherently care and doesn't necessarily speak quite enough to those that are most influential in engage, particularly with those who are most resistant to change at the moment. But there's a big movement, I know, in the, I suppose, marketing sector, where people are feeling really uncomfortable that they're using all their creativity and professional skills to sell products that make the world worse. And a sense of, well, how do we use those talents and deploy them? Because, you know, they've got brilliant insight into human psyche and driving behaviors, how to use that really strategically in support of different decisions.
Lindsay Hooper from Cambridge University, thank you so much.
Thank you.